Pandemia, com guerras e o avanço da crise climática, tem profissionais que acham que precisamos nos preparar melhor para tudo isso. São os chamados futuristas. Um deles é o Roger Spitz, que conversou com a CNN Brasil nesta semana. Ele aconselha empresas e líderes a tirarem proveito dos imprevistos. Em entrevista ao editor de Internacional, Diego Pavão, ele disse que precisamos repensar como lidamos com a mudança. E falou sobre o papel da inteligência artificial nesse cenário.
I think on one hand, you often hear that we're not cabled to think about exponential or quick changes. And at the same time, I think human beings are extremely incredible animals. You have the immune system, which gets resistance and builds immunity from shocks. You have animals or humans who prepare for changes of seasons and weather and put things aside, or nature itself is extraordinarily resilient and resourceful. So I wonder whether the human beings are fine, the earth is fine and the world is fine, but somehow our education systems, the way we're brought up, the culture, especially in the West where you're trying to be a perfectionist, is relying on a stable, predictable, linear world. And as soon as there are deviations or perceived mistakes, everything focuses back on the mechanic Newtonian perspective of the world. And compared to that, change seems surprising and difficult to handle. But maybe as humans, we actually deal with it very well. We just need to reframe how we think about change.
É muito difícil não falar de inteligência artificial quando a gente fala de mudanças. Na sua opinião, como essa inteligência artificial pode nos ajudar a enfrentar essas mudanças bruscas e essa imprevisibilidade?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to AI. I think there's advancing in an incremental manner science and knowledge, and I think it's very good at that because it's understandable, it's linear, it's predictable, how you can use AI as a platform for drug discovery. So that's very powerful. I think we need to be a little bit careful when you're really talking about unpredictability and non-linearity and complexity and unknown unknowns. At the end, the features of AI, which is processing a lot of information, pattern recognition, even if they're non-intuitive, when it's completely unpredictable, it's unknowable, it's unknown unknowns. And I'm not sure that relying on AI to help you with pure unpredictability is the way forward. I think it's better with incremental advances of things we understand than pure unpredictability.
Artigo recente para o Fórum Econômico Mundial, você falou sobre novos papéis que podem ser criados dentro de empresas para ajudar elas a lidarem com a imprevisibilidade e com as mudanças bruscas. Na sua opinião, as empresas e até os governos deveriam separar mais dinheiro, investir mais dinheiro em criar esses papéis, esses cargos e ter pessoas que estão cuidando disso especificamente?
I do, but they will save a lot of money, so I'll expand on that. The role I mentioned, indeed, I'm part of the global Foresight network of the World Economic Forum, and the role I mentioned is, which I invented, but it's the Chief Existential Officer. And the Chief Existential Officer is looking at low probability, but potentially very high outcome, very high impact events. They're not necessarily negative, because it can be existential for a company to be on the next development or innovation. So it's also for value creation. But basically, there are trillions of dollars that will be transferring in value. Some of it will be destroyed by events, by the environment, by new technologies. Some of it will be destroyed, and some of it will be created in terms of value creation. And when you look at the money that was lost in terms of managing inflation or interest rates, and basically, the assumption the world made is that you could control inflation. You didn't think about these potential huge unlikely events because they were low probabilities. But how much did it cost for the governments to print money to control the financial crash of 2008 or inflation? How much did it cost Germany to make the assumption that if it had a strong relationship with Russia, its energy and military security would be secured? And then when that assumption was wrong, everything went down. How much did it cost the world for COVID not to prepare? So the way I see the Chief Existential Officer is that those companies that are not thinking about the opportunities that are low probability but very high results are not creating as much value as they could. And those institutions, countries, and organizations that are not thinking about the risks that could be existential, which the chief existential officer should think about, even if they're low probability, but if it's asymmetric, high risk, basically you're saving billions of dollars or millions of dollars to waste trillions of dollars. And that's the case of COVID. The lack of preparation for a few $billion meant that the world wasted trillions of dollars. So the question is whether the salary of a chief existential officer and the idea is more costly than lack of preparation.
Você acha que também esses países em desenvolvimento, como o Brasil, a África do Sul, diferente dos países do G7, por exemplo, esses países podem lidar com a mudança brusca de uma forma melhor ou mesmo diferente?
So, I do to a degree, but I'm going to add a few layers. I think the first thing, maybe anecdotal, is that it's interesting the resemblance of countries. When I go to Rio and when I'm in Cape Town, it's almost identical with the sea and the mountains. So there's some analogies which are magical. I think in terms of resiliency and being able to sustain shocks, probably, unfortunately, part of the resilience of life and the world is that if you're in certain situations, I guess you get used to them. And I see Brazil as a very resourceful country, and so is a lot of Africa. I would put the challenge for Brazil, though, not in terms of how resilient it can be to shocks or pressure, but whether it can punch above its weight, given that it's more than 200 million people, given the power of the energy, the renewables, given the resourcefulness of people, given it's quite a unified country in a certain way. Like many countries, there's polarization, but it's quite unified. It's one language. There's an identity of Brazil, a flag. People are proud. And if you think of AI and ag tech and renewables, these are powerhouses where Brazil should be global leaders. So for me, what I would like to see, I know there's a kind of unfortunate joke about Brazil is always a country of tomorrow, but I think it can be the country of tomorrow for real and make it happen, because you look at countries like India, they didn't just think about the resiliency, they really pushed it to the next level of really thriving on that. And so I guess the challenge for Brazil is pushing beyond resiliency to really becoming what it should be in relation to its powerhouse, resourcefulness, human capital, commodities, and so many other features, and simply size. It's an enormous country, so it has so much potential, and I'm looking forward to it catching up with India and others.
Como eu disse na minha introdução, existem vários desafios hoje no mundo. Desses desafios que eu citei, quais deles te assustam mais? E se algum deles te assusta mais?
So, one of my favorite authors, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, wrote a book which is well known, and the name is well known, called Black Swans. He didn't coin that term. Black swans were in London in the 15th century. No one had seen a black swan, and so the word black swan was like something that seemed impossible or didn't exist. Of course, they do exist, but they didn't know. And Nassim Taleb calls black swan, and I think that's the term that's used, as something that's really unknowable. So you cannot, in a sense, prepare for it directly as a specific event because it's unknowable. I would caution two things, though. Number one is the world likes to say this is a black swan, it's unpredictable, you cannot possibly prepare for things that they should have been thinking about. The fact that a pandemic might arise, maybe we didn't know the name of it, the exact date or nature, but certain better preparation and resiliency around possible pandemics is not a black swan. It's something which the world chose to kind of ignore, even till it was very, very close. And then the second thing I would say is that even though you cannot prepare for a specific event, that doesn't mean you can't build resiliency in systems. You can't pay more attention to changes. Even just simply accepting that the world is constituted by more and more infrequent events, the news items which says first time ever, unpredictable, when you start seeing that every day, the world has to ask itself whether what's wrong is the way it's thinking about change, or whether actually you often have rare events and they seem to be accelerating. And so if we take that into account, you're building resiliency, you're building preparation, maybe you're changing the educational system, incentive structures, governance structures, and then you're not preparing for a specific shock that's unpredictable, but you have better resiliency and preparation for these kind of events.
Sobre o seu próximo livro, que vai ser lançado em setembro, O que os leitores podem esperar de conhecimento prático sobre lidar com a mudança brusca e a imprevisibilidade?
Yeah, so I put a lot of thought into it because when I read a lot of the literature around change, I felt that it was often very good or not, but at describing change. And the really difficult thing is, what do I do about it now? So what? And so I took on board basically 20 years advising boards, CEOs, and investors on the most strategic deals from my previous life as an investment banker in M&A, and tried to distill that with the key learnings from it, and trying to avoid the playbooks and this is how it works, because we don't know how it works. So the emphasis is very much on how do you think about discontinuity or disruption? How do you prepare for it? And it involves what we call, and it's the last chapter of the book, the disruptive thinking canvas, which are 6 steps which we feel are helpful to prepare for unpredictability and which are very tangible. We give examples, we have a canvas, and the idea is just a few elements, is really to be more thoughtful about how you evaluate weak signals and notice things. And then by noticing things and seeing the world differently and revising your assumptions, you're more likely to prepare differently. So how do you do that? How do you ideate? How do you prepare different scenarios? And then at some point you need to make decisions despite the uncertainty. And then you need a feedback loop because things constantly change. So it's really helping people with a concrete framework to allow them to not think about the prediction and to be better at predicting, but actually to think about accepting uncertainty and unpredictability and to be better at preparing for it.
No começo da nossa entrevista, eu te perguntei se os seres humanos lidam bem com a mudança, mas eu quero mudar um pouco essa pergunta e fazer a seguinte pergunta. Você lida bem com a mudança e o que desse seu trabalho você consegue trazer para a sua vida cotidiana sobre mudança e imprevisibilidade?
Love it. I think the honest answer is that I'm probably the worst person in the world in dealing with change in terms of how I was initially constituted. I was initially trained as a chartered accountant. I was in investment banking, a very structured, very hierarchical, very numbers, data-driven environment where my life worked like clockwork. And there's this famous Monty Python sketch, The Lion Tamer. And I'm basically Michael Palin in The Lion Tamer at that point as a chartered accountant where things are running like clockwork in terms of not being, I want to be a lion tamer, I want change, excitement, and not knowing how to handle it. And one of the reasons I actually decided to move out of investment banking, and nothing wrong with investment banking, but is that over the past maybe close to a decade, I got very interested in understanding better change and going down the rabbit hole about realizing that the assumption the whole world makes, companies, the consultants, everyone, most people, that the world is linear, stable, and predictable, that assumption is wrong. And the cost of making that assumption is increasing because there's an inverse relationship between predictability and uncertainty. And I feel that we're in a more uncertain environment. So long story short, after a few years of thinking more about Eastern philosophy and Zen Buddhism, where transience, mujo, change is a constant. Heraclitus, you never put your foot in the same water twice because the water is constantly flowing and your foot and your human being are changing. And when you bring into that, you realize that actually it's the way your environment, the education, your work, the incentives that make you constrained to not being comfortable with change. But actually, if you embrace different cultures, if you embrace Zen Buddhism, if you embrace other ways of seeing the world, you'll then prepare and respond differently to change. And so in my more recent life of the past few years, I think I'm probably doing, hopefully, a better job with change because I've reframed how I see the world. And therefore, if you see the world differently, you prepare differently and you respond differently.
Você veio do mercado financeiro. Como essa área te fez pensar sobre mudança e imprevisibilidade hoje no mundo?
Yeah, so some of it is what I saw in finance, and then some of it is also how the world has evolved, right, over the past decade. So, I mean, finance, there's nothing wrong with it. Well, there's a lot wrong with it, but I mean, it's not just because of finance that I wanted to change. It's also because of I was just noticing in the world that what was keeping CEOs up at night was no longer how do you use the playbook of whatever consultant? How do you get market share? How do you do tick the box innovation? I was seeing that change was changing and that there was a context where things were different. And so the main thing that made me change is realizing that survival and thriving in this world required us to reframe the way the world is thinking. It requires rethinking education systems, governance, and incentive structures, whether it's banking or any industry or countries. And that requires thinking more long-term, thinking more systemically, thinking about the next order implications of things, thinking of things that seem unrelated as to how they might connect. And once I started thinking about all that, I realized that I was living a professional career which was very successful, but which was disconnected with how I saw the world and what I thought was relevant to stay meaningful in the world. And so I moved in relation to that. And of course, banking and finance, like many industries, are very short term, are not thinking systemically. And the reality is that the most complex challenges we face today, whether it's climate, whether it's society, whether it's fairness, whether it's technology and AI, these are complex challenges for which, if you continue with the way the world currently operates, we're not going to find a solution to these complex challenges. So I really felt that as these complex challenges become more mature, climate change is not new, but it's becoming more tangible to more parts of the world. Same with AI, it's progressing in different ways. I felt that you can't continue to be the ostrich with the head in the sand. You have to kind of realize. And so becoming a professional futurist and thinking about these topics around unpredictability and how to deal with them, I felt was actually survival for humanity as opposed to just Roger changing his career.
Muito obrigado pela entrevista.
Obrigado a você.